The moment Erling Haaland stepped onto the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. Some passengers fumbled for their phones, eager to capture a glimpse of the Norwegian goal machine in person. The flight attendants, all too aware of his presence, moved with nervous efficiency, offering him a warm greeting. Haaland, dressed in a sleek tracksuit, nodded politely and made his way to his seat. 1A, the best spot on the plane. And that's when the trouble began. Captain Rob Halverson, a veteran pilot with more than 2 decades in the sky, was standing near the cockpit door, chatting with a couple of flight attendants. The moment he saw Haaland settle into his seat, a smirk crossed his lips. Well, Rob muttered under his breath. Looks like we got royalty on board. A few attendants chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was meant as a joke or something else. But the pilot wasn't done. As he adjusted his captain's hat, he strode down the aisle, stopping just beside Haaland's seat. The towering striker barely glanced up, focused on adjusting his noise-canceling headphones. "So, Mr. Superstar," Rob said, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I suppose first class is a bit different from the grass, huh?" Haaland slowly turned his head, his icy blue eyes locking onto the pilot. There was no emotion on his face, no reaction, just a measured, assessing stare. The air around them thickened. Passengers within earshot pretended not to listen, but their eyes darted between the two men. A few even leaned in slightly, sensing the tension brewing. Rob chuckled, mistaking Haaland's silence for submission. "I mean, running around chasing a ball must get exhausting. Thought you footballers needed all the rest you could get." Silence. A long, agonizing silence. Then, with a calm, almost lazy movement, Haaland pulled his headphones off and leaned back in his seat. "You always this chatty with passengers, Captain?" His voice was smooth, his Norwegian accent adding a layer of cool detachment that Rob's smirk faltered for just a second. But he wasn't about to back down. Not in front of a cabin full of wealthy, influential travelers. "Just making sure you're comfortable, superstar," Rob said, flashing a fake smile. "You know, it's funny. You footballers act like kings, but up here, you're just another passenger. No stadium, no fans, just a guy in a seat." A few gasps rippled through the cabin. A businessman in a tailored suit stole a glance at Haaland, expecting some sort of reaction. Haaland exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "That's cute," he said simply, before sliding his headphones back on. Rob clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being ignored, let alone by some young athlete who spent his life kicking a ball. This wasn't over. Oh no, not even close. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, the pilot had already made up his mind. He was going to teach Erling Haaland a lesson he would never forget. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, slicing through the sky with effortless grace. In the first-class cabin, champagne glasses clinked, quiet conversations hummed, and plush seats reclined with a soft whir. But for Captain Rob Halverson, there was a storm brewing, one fueled by ego and resentment. Back in the cockpit, his co-pilot, Ethan Carter, glanced at him with a raised brow. "You okay, Captain? You've been scowling ever since takeoff." Rob scoffed, adjusting the throttle. "Can you believe that guy? Erling Haaland, sitting back there like he owns the damn plane. These footballers think they're untouchable." Ethan smirked. "So, you're mad because a professional athlete is minding his own business?" Rob shot him a look. "He disrespected me by not reacting to your jab." Rob exhaled sharply. "Look, Ethan, you're young. You don't get it. I've been flying for over 20 years. I've seen all kinds of passengers, CEOs, politicians, celebrities. But there's something about these athletes. Arrogant, entitled, Like they think they're gods just because they can run fast and kick a ball. Ethan leaned back, hand behind his head. Or maybe he's just a guy trying to enjoy his flight without dealing with some pilot's ego trip. Rob ignored him, his fingers drumming against the throttle. This wasn't over. He couldn't let some overpaid footballer brush him off like that. No, he had to make a point. And he had just the plan. Back in first class, Haaland sat in his seat, flipping through the in-flight menu, unbothered. If the pilot wanted to play games, he didn't care. He dealt with worse. Jealous defenders trying to break his legs on the pitch, aggressive reporters looking for a reaction, social media trolls desperate for attention. This was nothing. The flight attendant approached with a polite smile. "Mr. Haaland, would you like to order dinner?" Before he could answer, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The smooth, practiced voice of Rob Halverson filled the cabin. But there was something else there, a smugness, a barely concealed edge of amusement. For those of you who may not know, we have a very special guest aboard today. A certain footballer famous for scoring goals is gracing us with his presence in first class. Now, I know some of you might be big fans, but let's all remember, this is an airplane, not a stadium. No need to get too excited. A few passengers chuckled, while others exchanged confused glances. Haaland, however, remained completely still. His fingers rested lightly on the menu, his expression unreadable. The pilot continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And of course, if our VIP guest gets tired of sitting, I'd be happy to let him take a jog down the aisle. Keep that world-class stamina up." This time, the laughter was louder. A businessman smirked. A couple of younger passengers muttered to each other, glancing toward Haaland's seat. The flight attendant looked mortified. I'm so sorry, Mr. Haaland." "I don't know why he would." Haaland held up a hand, silencing her. Then, ever so slowly, he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. That's how it was going to be. Find out if this pilot wanted a game. He'd get one. And he was going to lose. Haaland sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. The murmurs in the cabin hadn't died down yet. Passengers were still snickering, some throwing glances his way, curious to see if he would react. But he didn't. Not yet. He reached for his water bottle, unscrewed the cap with a slow, deliberate motion, and took a sip. His mind, however, was already working, calculating. On the pitch, he could dismantle an entire defense in seconds. This was just another opponent trying to get inside his head. Rob Halverson wanted a reaction. He wasn't going to get one, not the one he expected. Anyway, to in the cockpit. Rob leaned back in his seat, satisfied. "Did you hear that?" The guy didn't say a word. Probably sitting there, stewing. Ethan sighed. "You really think poking at a guy like Haaland is a smart move?" "Relax, Carter. I'm just having a little fun." Ethan shook his head. "You're playing with fire, Captain. Some people don't respond the way you think they will." Rob waved him off, but the words lingered. Something about Haaland's silence unsettled him. He had expected irritation, maybe a glare or a sarcastic remark. Instead, he got nothing. That was almost worse. Back in first class, the flight attendant from earlier, Emma, returned, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Haaland?" He looked up at her, his expression neutral. She hesitated. "I just wanted to apologize for the captain's unprofessionalism. That was completely out of line." Haaland offered a small nod. "Not your fault." Emma shifted on her feet. "Would you like me to file a report?" "I can," he raised a hand. "No need." She frowned. "Are you sure?" That was pretty humiliating. He exhaled slowly. "Not for me." She blinked, confused, before nodding and walking away. Haaland stretched his legs, his mind made up. He wasn't going to sit back and let this go. No, no, no. If this pilot wanted to play games, he would, but on his terms. And by the time this flight landed, Captain Rob Halverson would wish he had never opened his mouth. The tension in first class had settled into an uneasy quiet. Some passengers had already moved on, sipping their champagne and scrolling through their phones. But a few kept stealing glances at Haaland, waiting to see if the footballer would react to the pilot's taunts, but he didn't. Not right away. Instead, Haaland reached into the pocket of his tracksuit, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. His expression was unreadable, but there was the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. Then he leaned back, folded his arms, and waited in the cockpit. Rob checked the flight monitor. Everything was running smoothly. The plane was cruising at altitude, the autopilot handling most of the work. He stretched his arms with a satisfied sigh. "You know, Ethan, I should do stand-up comedy," he said with a smirk. "Did you hear the laughs back there? I had the whole first-class cabin entertained." Ethan didn't even look up from his controls. "Yeah, real comedy gold, Captain." Rob chuckled. "Oh, come on. Lighten up." Then, a ding that a message flashed on the cockpit screen, an internal notification from the airline's operations team. Rob frowned. That was unusual mid-flight. He clicked at Open.Urgent. "Captain Halverson, be advised, Erling Haaland has just tweeted about an interesting experience on your flight. High-level executives are monitoring. Await further instructions." The blood drained from his face. "What the hell?" he muttered. Ethan leaned over, catching a glimpse of the message. His eyes widened. Captain, I think you just made a really big mistake." Meanwhile, in first class, Haaland stared at his phone, watching as the numbers on his tweet skyrocketed. Thousands of retweets. Comments pouring in. News outlets picking it up almost instantly. The message itself was simple, just a casual remark about how some pilots think they're stand-up comedians, but forget they're flying a plane, not hosting a talk show. But the effect? Catastrophic. Sports journalists were already digging into it. Airline PR teams were scrambling. Fans were outraged. And Rob Halverson? He had just become most talked about pilot on the internet. Haaland smirked to himself, locking his phone. This was just the beginning that Rob's hands tightened around the control yoke as his face turned a deep shade of red. His heart pounded against his ribs as he reread the message from airline operations. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered under his breath. Ethan let out a low whistle. "You poked the wrong guy, Captain. Haaland's followers are insane. The airline's probably already getting flooded with complaints." Rob clenched his jaw. This wasn't just some joke anymore. This was turning into a problem. He quickly tapped a reply to the airline. "Situation under control. No further issues expected. Please advise." A response came almost instantly. "Senior management will review upon landing. Ensure all passengers receive a smooth and professional experience. And no further incidents." Rob exhaled sharply. That was corporate speak for "you screwed up." Don't make it worse, but it was worse. Because now, every move he made would be scrutinized. And Haaland? He was sitting back there like he had already W-O-N-O. Rob wasn't going to let some 23-year-old footballer ruin his reputation. He needed to regain control. In first class, Haaland stretched his legs and smiled to himself. He could feel the shift in energy. The flight attendants were walking on eggshells, whispering nervously to one another. Even some passengers were glancing at their phones, reading the online reactions in real time, that he had put the pressure right where he wanted it. On the captain, Emma, the flight attendant from earlier, hesitated before approaching again. "Mr. Haaland, would you like anything? Another drink, maybe?" He looked up at her, amused. "I think the pilot might need one more than me." She covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. "You really got to him, huh?" Haaland smirked. He wanted a reaction. Now he's got one. She leaned in slightly. To be honest, Captain Halverson has a bit of a reputation. You're not the first passenger he's made snide comments about, but you might be the last. Haaland raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Emma straightened. Let me know if you need anything. As she walked away, Haaland's phone vibrated. He glanced down. A text from his agent. What happened? The airline just called me. Haaland grinned. He cracked his knuckles and prepared to type back. The fun was just beginning. Rob's grip on the yoke tightened as his mind raced. He had faced turbulence, engine failures, and emergency landings before. But this was something different. His name was trending. Social media was eating him alive. The airline's reputation was now tangled up with his actions, and he knew exactly what that meant. Trouble. Ethan, his co-pilot, sighed. Captain, maybe it's time to just apologize. Rob snapped his head toward him. Apologize? For what? A harmless joke. Ethan gave him a look. You insulted one of the most famous athletes in the world over the intercom in front of first-class passengers. That's not a joke. That's stupidity. Rob exhaled through his nose. Fina, I'll smooth things over, but I'm not groveling. Before he could even reach for the intercom, another message popped up on the cockpit screen. Captain Halverson, report to airline management immediately after landing. Senior executives are now aware of the situation. Ensure professionalism for the remainder of the flight. Rob's stomach twisted. He wasn't just in trouble. He was being watched. Meanwhile, in first class, Haaland glanced at his phone. His agent had responded. The airline CEO is aware. Expect a formal apology soon. Want me to escalate this? Haaland smirked. He typed back. Not yet. Let's see if he figures it out himself. Emma, the flight attendant, approached again, looking nervous. Mr. Haaland, the captain, I think he's about to make an announcement. Haaland raised an eyebrow. This should be interesting. The announcement, a few moments later, the intercom crackled. Rob's voice came through, noticeably less smug than before. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to take a moment to address a comment I made earlier in the flight. It seems some may have taken it the wrong way. Of course, my intention was only to keep things lighthearted. We value all our passengers, regardless of profession. Silence. Passengers exchanged looks. A few chuckled awkwardly. Haaland? He just shook his head. That wasn't an apology. That was damage control. Emma leaned over and whispered, he's still trying to save face. Haaland took another sip of his water. Let him, because at this point, nothing Rob Halverson said could stop what was coming. Rob's grip on the yoke tightened as his mind raced. He had faced turbulence, engine failures, and emergency landings before. But this was something different. His name was trending. Social media was eating him alive. The airline's reputation was now tangled up with his actions, and he knew exactly what that meant. Trouble. Ethan, his co-pilot, sighed. Captain, maybe it's time to just apologize. Rob snapped his head toward him. Apologize? For what? A harmless joke. Ethan gave him a look. You insulted one of the most famous athletes in the world over the intercom in front of first-class passengers. That's not a joke. That's stupidity. Rob exhaled through his nose. Fina, I'll smooth things over, but I'm not groveling. Before he could even reach for the intercom, another message popped up on the cockpit screen. Captain Halverson, report to airline management immediately after landing. Senior executives are now aware of the situation. Ensure professionalism for the remainder of the flight. Rob's stomach twisted. He wasn't just in trouble. He was being watched. Meanwhile, in first class, Haaland glanced at his phone. His agent had responded. The airline CEO is aware. Expect a formal apology soon. Want me to escalate this? Haaland smirked. He typed back, "Not yet. Let's see if he figures it out himself." Emma, the flight attendant, approached again, looking nervous. "Mr. Holland, the captain, well, I think he's about to make an announcement." Holland raised an eyebrow. "This should be interesting." The announcement, a few moments later, the intercom crackled. Rob's voice came through, noticeably less smug than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to take a moment to address a comment I made earlier in the flight. It seems some may have taken it the wrong way. Of course, my intention was only to keep things lighthearted. We value all our passengers, regardless of profession." Silence. Passengers exchanged looks. A few chuckled awkwardly. Holland? He just shook his head. That wasn't an apology. That was damage control. Emma leaned over and whispered, "He's still trying to save face." Holland took another sip of his water. Let him, because at this point, nothing Rob Halverson said could stop what was coming. Rob sat in the cockpit, his jaw clenched as he listened to the silence that followed his half-hearted announcement. No applause, no laughter, just an awkward void where his ego used to be. Ethan let out a low chuckle. "Wow, that was pathetic." Rob shot him a glare. "What do you want me to do? Beg?" Ethan shrugged. "No, but maybe try sounding like you actually mean it." Rob shook his head. "Forget it. Once we land, this'll blow over." Ethan smirked. "Oh yeah? You might want to check your phone, Captain." Rob hesitated before unlocking his screen. And there it was. Every major sports media outlet was now covering the story. Pilot mocking Haaland mid-flight. Erling faces per nightmare. Erling Haaland stays silent, but social media speaks for him. Airline issues statement. "We are investigating the incident." His heart sank. Investigating? That was corporate speak for deciding how to fire you. And then, the worst notification of all. Incoming message. Airline CEO office. Rob's throat went dry. He tapped the message open. "Captain Halverson, we will have senior leadership waiting upon your arrival. Do not engage further with the passenger in question. We expect professionalism." His hands trembled. This wasn't just bad. This was career-ending. In first class. Holland sat comfortably, his face unreadable, but Emma noticed the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. "Captain's not having a good day," she whispered. Holland exhaled through his nose. He had it coming. Emma hesitated. "You could probably stop this, you know." A statement, a tweet. People listen to you. Holland glanced at her. And what lesson would that teach him? She bit her lip. "You're really going to let him crash and burn, huh?" Holland leaned back, hands behind his head. He took the first shot. "I just passed the ball." Emma shook her head with a chuckle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Holland smirked. Smart choice. Because by the time this flight touched the ground, Rob Halverson's world would be in free fall. Rob's hands were sweaty. His once confident smirk was long gone, replaced by a grim, pale expression as the reality of the situation sank in. The cockpit was silent except for the steady hum of the engines. Even Ethan, usually full of sarcastic quips, stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything. Rob's career was unraveling before his eyes. His phone buzzed again. Another email. "Captain Halverson, please be advised that a formal inquiry into passenger treatment is now underway. Your cooperation is expected upon landing." Rob swallowed hard. That was it. His fate was being decided at corporate headquarters, and there was nothing he could do about it. In first class. Holland's phone vibrated. A new text from his agent. Airline's PR team reached out. "They're scrambling. They're asking if you'd be willing to accept a personal apology from the pilot to smooth this over." Holland smirked. "Tell them I'll think about it. After we land." He put his phone away and stretched his legs. The tension in first class was thick, but he remained unfazed. Emma returned, holding a fresh glass of water. Captain's in full panic mode. Haaland chuckled. Good. She hesitated. So what's your plan? Gonna let him twist in the wind? Haaland took a slow sip before answering. I'll decide when we land. Emma nodded, impressed. You really know how to play the long game, huh? Haaland simply smiled, because Rob Halverson had made his move. Now, it was Haaland's turn to finish the game. The plane began its descent, the engines humming steadily as the landing gear prepared to deploy. The usual pre-landing announcements were made, but this time, Captain Rob Halverson's voice was noticeably absent. In the cockpit, Rob sat frozen, staring at the flight controls as if they held the answer to his problems. But there was no escape now. Ethan, arms crossed, finally broke the silence. You gonna say something? Rob exhaled sharply. What's there to say? Ethan shrugged. I don't know, maybe something like, hey, I shouldn't have insulted one of the biggest athletes in the world over the intercom while flying a plane full of passengers who all have phones and Twitter accounts. Rob glared at him. Not helping, Carter. Ethan smirked. Wasn't trying to. Another notification popped up on the cockpit screen. Senior management will be present upon landing. Prepare to report immediately. Rob swallowed hard. His career was officially in freefall. In first class, Haaland sat calmly, glancing out the window as the city below came into view. He could feel the shift in energy. Passengers were excited to land, but a few still stole glances at him, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Emma returned for one last check. We're almost there. Any final moves before touchdown? Haaland smirked. Let's see if the captain comes to his senses first. Emma raised an eyebrow. And if he doesn't? Haaland leaned back. Then he lands into a bigger mess than the one he created. Emma let out a low whistle. Remind me never to mess with you. He chuckled. You're not the first to say that. The plane made smooth contact with the runway, tires screeching slightly as it slowed. The cabin erupted in quiet relief, passengers stretching, grabbing their belongings, ready to disembark. But for Rob Halverson, this landing wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of his reckoning. The plane taxied to the gate, and Rob Halverson could barely hear the usual landing announcements over the deafening silence in his own head. His fingers tapped nervously against the yoke as he stared at the cockpit door, knowing what was waiting for him beyond it. His career, hanging by a thread. Ethan shut off the autopilot and turned to him. Well, Captain, it's showtime. Rob didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, pushed open the cockpit door, and stepped into the aisle in first class. Haaland was still seated, relaxed, scrolling through his phone as the other passengers gathered their belongings. He barely looked up as Rob approached, his expression unreadable. Emma and a few other flight attendants watched from the sidelines, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Rob cleared his throat. His voice was quieter than before, lacking its usual arrogance. Mr. Haaland, he hesitated, swallowing his pride. I just want to say, maybe I took things too far. Haaland finally looked up, meeting his gaze. The tension in the air was suffocating. Passengers around them slowed their movements, sensing the moment. Rob forced a stiff smile. I meant no offense. Just thought I was being funny. Haaland let the silence drag. Then he smirked. And how's that working out for you? Rob's face twitched. He exhaled. Not great. Haaland nodded, as if considering something. Then he stood up. Even in the spacious first-class cabin, his towering frame made Rob feel small. You know, Haaland said casually, adjusting his watch, I respect a good joke, but respect goes both ways. Rob clenched his jaw. I get that now. Haaland stared at him for a beat longer, then shrugged. Good. He stepped past Rob, grabbing his bag. And just like that, he was gone, walking off the plane as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just unraveled a man's career with a few well-placed moves. Rob exhaled heavily, turning to see Ethan watching him from the cockpit door. "Well," Ethan said with a grin, "that was painful." Rob didn't respond, because as he stepped off the plane, two stern-looking airline executives were already waiting for him at the gate. And this time, there was no escape.